My husband's dad threatened to cut us off if we didn't have a baby. When we finally got pregnant, his reaction left us speechless. My husband Jonathan, 30M, and I have been married for 4 years now. We met in college during our senior year when we were paired up for a group project in our business ethics class. Jonathan was the quiet, studious type, while I was more outgoing. We balanced each other out perfectly, and soon our study sessions turned into coffee dates, then dinner dates, and before we knew it, we were inseparable. We dated for 2 years before tying the knot. During those years, we both focused on starting our careers. Jonathan landed a job at a marketing firm, while I worked at a local boutique, dreaming of one day opening my own store. We were young and in love, but also ambitious and career-driven. My parents have always been pretty laid back. They're both teachers who believe in letting their children find their own path in life. When Jonathan and I got engaged, they were thrilled but never once asked about our plans for kids or pressured us about the future. They were just happy to see me happy. But Jonathan's father, Richard, is a whole different story. Richard comes from a traditional background. He worked his way up from a factory worker to owning his own construction company, and he has very set ideas about family and success. From the moment Jonathan introduced me to his parents, Richard started hinting about grandkids. At first, it was just casual comments here and there. He'd say things like, "This house has plenty of room for little ones to run around," or "I can't wait to teach my grandkids how to fish." But as time went on, it became more frequent and pushy. When we got engaged, Richard cornered me at our engagement party. I remember it vividly. I was chatting with some college friends when Richard approached, a glass of whiskey in hand. He put his arm around my shoulders and said, "You know, sweetheart, the most important thing a woman can do is give her husband children. The sooner, the better." I was shocked and didn't know how to respond. Jonathan saw my discomfort and quickly came to my rescue, changing the subject. Jonathan's mother, Amber, 58F, is much more reasonable. She often tries to change the subject when Richard brings up the topic of grandchildren, but he doesn't take the hint. Amber works as a librarian and has always been supportive of Jonathan's choices. She's told me privately that she wishes Richard would back off, but she's never been able to stand up to him effectively. Jonathan has 2 older sisters, Felicity, 35F, and Emily, 33F, who both have kids. Felicity has 2 boys, aged 7 and 5, while Emily has a 3-year-old daughter. You'd think that would be enough for Richard, but apparently not. He's always talking about how he wants a big family, how he grew up with lots of cousins and wants the same for his grandkids. After we got married, the pressure from Richard intensified. He'd call us every week, asking if we had any news to share. When we'd say no, he'd launch into a lecture about how we weren't getting any younger and how important family is. Jonathan tried to explain that we weren't ready for kids yet, that we wanted to focus on our careers first, but Richard wouldn't listen. Jonathan and I have had countless discussions about this. We do want kids eventually, but we're both focused on our careers right now. I recently started my own small business, a boutique clothing store, turning my longtime dream into reality. It's taking up a lot of my time and energy, but I love every minute of it. Jonathan is working hard at his job in marketing, hoping for a promotion soon. We want to be financially stable and have more free time before we bring a child into the world. Things came to a head at our last Thanksgiving dinner. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion. Jonathan had just received a small promotion at work, and I had successfully expanded my boutique's online presence, increasing our sales significantly. We were excited to share our news with the family. But Richard had a few too many drinks and started loudly complaining about how we were denying him more grandchildren. He even went as far as to say that maybe Jonathan should find a wife who actually wanted to start a family. The room fell silent. I felt like I'd been slapped. Jonathan was furious. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and told his father to back off and respect our choices. "Dad, that's enough," Jonathan said, his voice tight with anger. "Our life choices are none of your business. If you can't respect that, maybe we shouldn't come around so often." Richard's face turned red. He slammed his glass down on the table and stormed out of the house. Amber followed him, apologizing profusely. Felicity and Emily tried to smooth things over, but the damage was done. We left shortly after, the festive mood completely ruined. Since then, Richard has been giving us the cold shoulder. He doesn't call anymore, and when we see him at family gatherings, he barely acknowledges our presence. Amber keeps trying to smooth things over, calling us regularly to check in and apologize for Richard's behavior. But Jonathan and I are actually relieved to have a break from the constant nagging. The whole situation has put a strain on our relationship with Jonathan's family. Felicity and Emily have been supportive of us, understanding our position all too well. They've told us how Richard's pressure affected their own decisions to have children earlier than they might have otherwise. Felicity confided in me over coffee one day. Don't get me wrong, I love my boys more than anything. But sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd waited a few more years to have them. I was just starting to climb the corporate ladder when I got pregnant with my first. It definitely changed my career trajectory. Emily had a similar story. She admitted that she sometimes resents having had kids so young, even though she loves her daughter dearly. I feel like I missed out on so much, she said. All my friends were traveling and pursuing their passions, and I was changing diapers and dealing with sleepless nights. Their stories only reinforce our decision to wait until we feel truly ready for parenthood. We don't want to resent our future children or feel like we missed out on important experiences. I've tried talking to Amber about the situation, hoping she could help Richard understand our perspective. We met for lunch at a quiet cafe, away from the prying ears of the rest of the family. Amber listened sympathetically as I poured out my frustrations. I understand, dear, she said, patting my hand. Richard has always been set in his ways. He means well, but he doesn't always express it in the best way. She went on to explain that Richard's obsession with family comes from his own upbringing. He was an only child and always felt lonely growing up. He vowed to have a big family of his own, and now he wants to extend that to grandchildren. It doesn't excuse his behavior, Amber said, but maybe it helps explain it a little. She promised to try talking to Richard again, but warned me not to expect miracles. He's stubborn, but he loves Jonathan. Eventually, he'll come around. But weeks have passed, and nothing has changed. If anything, the tension has only grown. Jonathan is becoming increasingly frustrated with his father's behavior. He's started talking about skipping family events to avoid the drama. I'm at a loss for what to do. Part of me wants to just cut Richard out of our lives completely, but I know that would hurt Jonathan and potentially damage his relationships with the rest of his family. At the same time, I don't want to give in to Richard's demands just to keep the peace. Jonathan and I have discussed moving to a different city for a fresh start. There's a possibility of Jonathan transferring to his company's office in Seattle, and I could potentially open a second location for my boutique there. But we're hesitant to leave our support network behind. Plus, it feels like we'd be running away from the problem instead of facing it head-on. The stress of the situation is starting to affect other areas of our lives. Jonathan has been having trouble sleeping, tossing and turning at night as he mulls over the family drama. I've found myself becoming short-tempered at work, snapping at my employees over small mistakes. We both know this can't continue. We've tried to focus on the positive aspects of our lives. Our careers are going well, we're financially stable, and our relationship is strong. But Richard's disapproval casts a shadow over everything. I'm looking for advice on how to handle this situation. How can we set firm boundaries with Richard without completely alienating him? Is there any way to make him understand that his behavior is pushing us away rather than bringing us closer? Should we consider the move to Seattle, or would that be avoiding the issue? Any suggestions would be appreciated. We're at our wits' end and could really use some outside perspective on this family drama. Update 1: It's been about 2 months since my original post, and a lot has happened. First of all, thank you to everyone who offered advice and support. Your comments and messages really helped Jonathan and I navigate this difficult situation. After reading through the comments, Jonathan and I decided to have one last serious conversation with Richard before taking more drastic measures. We spent several days preparing for this conversation, discussing what we wanted to say and how we wanted to approach it. We even role-played different scenarios to make sure we were ready for whatever Richard might say. We invited Richard and Amber over for dinner, thinking a neutral setting might help keep things calm. I spent the afternoon cooking Richard's favorite meal, pot roast with all the fixings. I hoped that the gesture might help soften him up a bit. The evening of the dinner arrived, and the tension was palpable from the moment Richard and Amber walked through our door. Richard was clearly still angry about the Thanksgiving incident. His jaw was set in a hard line, and he barely said a word as we ate. Amber tried to make small talk, commenting on the food and asking about our jobs, but the conversation felt forced and uncomfortable. Finally, as we were finishing up dessert, Jonathan took a deep breath and addressed the elephant in the room. He told his father that while we value family, the constant pressure about having kids was damaging our relationship. I watched Richard's face carefully as Jonathan spoke, noticing how his expression shifted from anger to something that looked almost like confusion. When Jonathan finished, I chimed in. I explained how we felt Richard was disrespecting our choices and timeline. I also mentioned how hurtful it was when he suggested Jonathan should find a different wife. As I spoke, I saw Amber nodding along, clearly agreeing with us. To our surprise, Richard didn't explode as we expected. Instead, he got very quiet. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Just as I was about to say something to break the tension, Richard started to speak. He told us about his own father, Jonathan's grandfather, whom I'd never met. Apparently, Richard's father had been extremely critical of him, always pushing him to do better and achieve more. Nothing Richard did was ever good enough for his father. "I swore I'd never be like that with my own kids," Richard said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I wanted to be encouraging, to push you to be your best selves. I guess somewhere along the line, I crossed that line without even realizing it." It was a breakthrough moment. Richard apologized for his behavior, saying he never meant to hurt us. He explained that in his mind, he was just trying to encourage us to experience the joy of parenthood that he'd found with his own children. But he recognized now that his approach was all wrong. We spent the next couple of hours having an honest, open conversation about our feelings and expectations. Jonathan shared how the pressure had actually made him more hesitant about having kids, not less. He talked about how he always felt like he was competing with his sisters for Richard's approval, and how that had affected his self-esteem over the years. I talked about my fears of not being ready for motherhood and how Richard's comments had amplified those fears. I explained how important my career was to me, and how I wanted to feel established in my business before taking on the challenge of parenthood. As we talked, I could see Richard really listening for perhaps the first time. He asked questions, seeking to understand our perspective rather than just pushing his own agenda. Amber contributed too, sharing her own regrets about not standing up to Richard more over the years. By the end of the evening, we'd reached an understanding. Richard promised to back off about the grandkids issue and respect our timeline. In return, we agreed to keep him and Amber in the loop about our future plans, without feeling pressured to make decisions before we're ready. The weeks following that dinner were a bit awkward as we all adjusted to our new dynamic. There were a few slip-ups, old habits die hard, after all. But each time Richard started to veer into familiar territory, he'd catch himself and change the subject. Gradually, the atmosphere in the family has improved dramatically. Richard has kept his word and hasn't mentioned grandkids once. Instead, he's shown more interest in our careers and other aspects of our lives. One Saturday, Richard surprised us by showing up at my boutique. I was wary at first, wondering if this was going to be another attempt to talk about babies. But instead, he rolled up his sleeves and asked how he could help. He spent the afternoon helping me rearrange the store layout, offering suggestions based on his experience in construction. It was the first time we'd ever really worked together on something, and it was actually fun. Jonathan and his father have been spending more time together too. They've started going fishing on weekends, something they used to do when Jonathan was a kid but had fallen out of habit as adults. Jonathan comes back from these trips looking relaxed and happy, telling me stories about the conversations they've had out on the lake. This experience has also prompted Jonathan and I to have more serious discussions about our own future. We've started to tentatively plan for when we might want to start trying for a baby, thinking maybe in a year or two. But the key difference is that it feels like our decision now, not something we're being pushed into. We've also been working on our communication as a couple. The whole experience with Richard made us realize that we need to be a united front when dealing with family issues. We've started having weekly check-ins where we discuss any concerns or issues that have come up, making sure we're always on the same page. I'm sharing this update because I know a lot of people suggested cutting Richard out of our lives completely. While that might have been necessary if things hadn't improved, I'm glad we gave him one last chance. People can change if they're willing to recognize their mistakes and put in the effort. Of course, we're staying vigilant. If Richard starts slipping back into his old habits, we won't hesitate to set firm boundaries again. But for now, we're cautiously optimistic about the future of our family relationships. It's been a challenging few months, but I feel like we've all come out stronger on the other side. We're looking forward to the future, whatever it may hold, knowing that we have the tools to communicate effectively and respect each other's choices. Update 2. It's been about 6 months since my last update, and I wanted to share some developments in our situation. Things with Richard have continued to improve, which has been a relief. He's kept his word about not pressuring us about having kids, and our relationship with him has actually grown stronger as a result. Jonathan and Richard have maintained their weekend fishing trips, and I've noticed a significant change in Jonathan's demeanor. He seems more relaxed and confident, especially when it comes to family interactions. Last month, Jonathan shared a touching moment he had with his father during one of their trips. Apparently, they were sitting in the boat, waiting for the fish to bite, when Richard turned to Jonathan and said, "Son, I want you to know how proud I am of you. Not because of any grandkids or family expectations, but because of the man you've become. You're successful in your career, you have a strong marriage, and you stand up for what you believe in. That's all a father could ask for." Jonathan told me he nearly fell out of the boat in shock. It was the kind of validation he'd been seeking from his father for years, and it came when he least expected it. This moment seems to have healed something deep within Jonathan, and I've noticed he's been much more relaxed around his family ever since. As for me, my relationship with Richard has also improved. He's shown a genuine interest in my boutique, often asking about how business is going and offering advice when I ask for it. Last month, when I was struggling with a difficult supplier, Richard used his business connections to help me find a better alternative. It was a gesture that meant a lot to me and showed how far we've come. However, we've encountered an unexpected twist in our story. About 2 months ago, I started feeling unwell. At first, I thought it was just stress from running my boutique. We just launched a new summer collection and things were hectic. But the symptoms persisted. I was constantly tired, feeling nauseous, and my appetite was all over the place. After a few weeks of this, Jonathan convinced me to see a doctor. I remember sitting in the sterile exam room, nervously fiddling with my wedding ring as we waited for the results of the tests they'd run. When the doctor came back in with a smile on her face, I knew before she even said the words. I was pregnant. Jonathan and I were stunned. We had been planning to start trying in about a year, but life had other plans. After the initial shock wore off, we realized we were excited about this unexpected turn of events. We decided to keep the news to ourselves for a while as we processed it and made sure everything was progressing well. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on us. Just when Richard had finally backed off about grandchildren, we were about to give him exactly what he wanted. We were a bit nervous about how to share the news, worried that it might undo all the progress we'd made in our relationship with him. As the weeks passed and my pregnancy progressed, we started making plans. We converted our home office into a nursery, picking out soft yellow paint for the walls and gender-neutral decorations. Jonathan threw himself into researching the safest cribs and car seats, while I found myself constantly browsing tiny baby clothes online. We also had to figure out how this would affect our careers. I spent many late nights at the boutique, training my assistant manager to take on more responsibilities. Jonathan started discussions with his boss about paternity leave and flexible working hours. Last weekend, we decided it was time to tell the family. We invited everyone over for a barbecue, including Richard and Amber, and Jonathan's sisters and their families. I was a bundle of nerves as we prepared for the gathering, worried about how Richard would react. The day of the barbecue was beautiful, warm and sunny. As Jonathan manned the grill, I mingled with our guests, trying to act normal despite the secret we were about to share. After everyone had eaten, we gathered them in the living room. Jonathan squeezed my hand as we stood up to make our announcement. "We have some news to share," Jonathan began, his voice slightly shaky. "We're expecting a baby." The reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Amber burst into happy tears, Jonathan's sisters rushed to hug me, and their kids were excited about having a new cousin. But it was Richard's reaction that surprised us the most. Instead of the triumphant "I told you so" we half expected, Richard was quiet at first. Then he stood up, walked over to us, and gave us both a big hug. With tears in his eyes, he told us how happy he was for us, but then he did something unexpected. He apologized again for all the pressure he'd put on us before, saying that he realized now more than ever how special and personal this moment is, and how wrong he was to try to force it. It was a touching moment that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Richard then lightened the mood by joking that the baby had impeccable timing, waiting until he'd learned to keep his mouth shut before making an appearance. The rest of the afternoon was filled with excited chatter about the baby. Richard, to his credit, was careful not to dominate the conversation or make assumptions about our plans. He asked thoughtful questions and listened attentively to our answers. In a quiet moment, Richard pulled me aside and told me that he was proud of the way Jonathan and I had handled his behavior, standing our ground and helping him see the error of his ways. He promised to be a supportive grandfather who respects our parenting decisions. As for Jonathan and me, we're adjusting to the idea of becoming parents sooner than we'd planned. There's a lot to figure out, especially with my business, but we're excited about this new chapter in our lives. We're grateful that we'll be entering parenthood with a stronger, healthier family dynamic than we had a year ago. This experience has taught us a lot about the importance of communication, setting boundaries, and giving people the chance to grow and change. We're looking forward to the future with optimism, knowing that we have a supportive family behind us. Update 3. It's been a whirlwind few months since my last update, and I wanted to share the latest developments in our story. Our baby girl, Sophia, was born 3 weeks ago, and she's absolutely perfect. The birth went smoothly, and we've been adjusting to life as new parents. The night Sophia was born was intense. My water broke unexpectedly while we were having dinner with Richard and Amber. In the midst of the panic and excitement, it was actually Richard who kept a cool head. He calmly drove us to the hospital while Jonathan sat in the backseat with me, timing my contractions. Throughout my 14-hour labor, our family took turns supporting us. Amber brought us iced chips and words of encouragement, while Richard paced the waiting room, occasionally popping his head in to check on us. When Sophia finally arrived, the look of pure joy on Jonathan's face as he held her for the first time is something I'll never forget. What I really want to talk about, though, is how this experience has continued to transform our relationship with Richard. Throughout my pregnancy, he remained respectful and supportive, never overstepping the boundaries we'd established. He and Amber offered help when we needed it, but always asked first instead of assuming. When Richard held Sophia for the first time, I saw a softer side of him that I'd never witnessed before. His hands, usually rough from years of construction work, were incredibly gentle as he cradled her. He looked at her with such wonder and love, it brought tears to my eyes. He thanked us for allowing him to be part of this special moment, acknowledging that his past behavior could have easily led to him being excluded. In the weeks since Sophia's birth, Richard has proven to be an amazing grandfather. He's eager to help but always checks with us first. When we were struggling with assembling the crib, he offered to help but waited for Jonathan to accept before stepping in. He's respected our wishes about visitors and has been careful not to offer unsolicited advice about parenting. One evening, while Richard was helping Jonathan assemble some baby furniture, they had a heart-to-heart conversation. Jonathan shared with me later that his father opened up about his own insecurities as a parent and grandfather. Richard admitted that his pushy behavior about grandchildren stemmed from a fear of being left out or becoming irrelevant in his children's lives as they grew older. This vulnerability from Richard has brought him and Jonathan closer than ever. It's helped Jonathan understand his father better and even reflect on how he wants to approach fatherhood himself. As for me, I found an unexpected ally in Richard. He's been incredibly supportive of my decision to eventually return to running my boutique, offering to help with childcare once I'm ready. This is a far cry from his previous stance that women should focus solely on motherhood. He's even been learning about baby fashion, joking that he needs to make sure his granddaughter is the best-dressed baby in town. Looking back on the journey we've been through with Richard, from the overbearing father-in-law who caused us so much stress to the doting grandfather he is now, I'm amazed at how much has changed. It's a powerful reminder that people can grow and relationships can heal if everyone is willing to communicate openly and make an effort. Our story could have easily gone a different way if we'd cut Richard out of our lives as some had suggested. While I know that's sometimes necessary in toxic relationships, I'm glad we found a way to work through our issues. The Richard we know now is someone we're happy to have in our lives and in Sophia's life. As we navigate the challenges of new parenthood, we're grateful to have the support of our whole family, Richard included. It's not always perfect, and we still have moments of disagreement, but the foundation of respect and understanding we've built makes all the difference. To anyone else dealing with difficult in-laws or family members, I hope our story can offer some hope. Change is possible, but it requires patience, clear communication, and a willingness from all parties to listen and grow. It's not an easy journey, but in our case, it was certainly worth it.